Welcome, Gerard here. This grey but quite mild day in the West End. Now, if you've never met me before, I'm Gerard, Gerhard, Gerardo, and I've been an actor 25 years. I know I don't look old enough. I was a child star, of course. And I've been a tour guide around 20 years, off and on, in normally the West End, London, the South Bank, and so on. What we're going to do today is take a look at a few, well, I call them hidden theatres. They're not so much hidden as they're tricky to find because the names sometimes have changed, or the locations might be hidden behind other buildings, or simply because the shows that are on in those theatres have been there so long, but then there's no name of the theatre, simply a billboard with the show that covers the name of the theatre. So I often find when I'm giving people directions, if I get stopped on the street and people say, where is this landmark? I don't say, oh, go down Manet Street and take a right along Haymarket and so on. I say, go to Phantom of the Opera, walk up, and you'll see Moulin Rouge, and then take a left there. So that seems to be the way we do it. There are a few theatres which are iconic, which you mention the name of the theatre first. Places like the Globe, the National, the Royal Opera House. But mainly, you mention the Royal Opera House quite loudly, just to explain to people how rich you are. Thank you for contributions in advance. Thank you, Manu, and welcome, everyone. Let's turn this around to see where we are right now. So this is the Hungerford Bridge. There are actually 3 bridges here. There's a rail bridge in the middle, and there are 2 footbridges, which are just over 20 years old. And a lot of the area that we're stood on at the moment was designed and orchestrated by a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. So a lot of this was part of the river until about the 1860s. And they redesigned the sewer systems. Bazalgette put all of the sewers underneath us. So as we turn the camera round, even though it doesn't look as much these days, there is a slight slope leading to the actual West End, to roads like the Strand and places like Trafalgar Square and Covent Garden. And the water slopes down, and then as you walk along the river, you'll find pumping stations which pump that waste further and further along until it gets out to places like Essex, where the River Thames, is so wide and so deep that the river can take that waste. This is the Playhouse Theatre right in front of us. And it is one of those hidden theatres, mainly because of the name. When you say to people, where's the Playhouse Theatre? That's like saying, where's the theatre? They used to all be called playhouses. And then this word, theatre, turned up. Theatre was from the Latin word theatrum, place for viewing. And this is known as the Playhouse Theatre, but at the moment it's known as the Kit Kat Club, because it's showing cabaret, which is set in Berlin in the 1930s. So they redesigned the entire auditorium to look like the inside of a cabaret venue. And the entrance is where the stage door actually is, and you go down some tunnels and alleyways until you're in the auditorium. It's a clever way of doing it. Was originally called the Royal Avenue, built in 1882, renamed the Playhouse in 1907. And because this was all new land and reclaimed land, and they built on top of what was the river, they thought, well, we put all the sewer systems here. They built the Victoria Embankment, which goes all the way along the river, and then on the other side you've got the Albert Embankment. They thought it would be nice to have a few venues here, and this is one of them. In the beginning, it was a place for musical theatre, I suppose you'd call it, vaudeville, burlesque. And it seems quite fitting that cabaret, this kind of burlesque style show, is on here at the moment. But within only a few years, drama took over because the theatre was small enough to take it. The Scandi noir of its day. So plays like Peer Gynt and Hedda Gabler, The Master Builder, these great Ibsen plays were on here. Strindberg, Swedish writer, George Bernard Shaw, of course. His plays were on here. And in the 1950s, the building was taken over by the BBC as a bit of a radio studio. So if you know, wherever you're from, all over the world, you may know shows like The Goon Show, Hancock's Half Hour, Steptoe and Son. The radio versions of those shows were recorded here. Then it became a concert venue. Had quite a few unknown bands like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. These bands that didn't do so well for themselves. If you've ever seen the Queen video, It's a Kind of Magic, that was filmed inside the Playhouse Theatre. It's owned by the Ambassador Theatre Group, by the way. ATG, they call it. So there are quite a few theatre groups in the West End. There are around 43 theatres owned by either Lloyd Webber Theatres or the Ambassador Theatre Group, or NIMAX, which is Nika Burns and Max Weizenhofer, or Delfont Mackintosh, which is partly owned by Cameron Mackintosh. I played there, by the way. I played in this theatre. I did a show called 1984, about 6 years ago. It was good. It was kind of a sad event because it's quite a tragic little show. It wasn't fun and games on stage. So we all decided, because the dressing rooms are all one corridor, there were 4 dressing rooms on either side, we decided to buy AstroTurf, artificial grass, and build a village green so we could just chill out when we weren't on stage. Herman Melville lived here in 1849, just before he wrote Moby Dick. Now, this area was full of ships, full of people shoveling coal onto ships, full of fishermen. They were still, in the mid-1800s, they were still fishing for salmon and so on in the river, so it may well have influenced him to write Moby Dick. There weren't too many whales in this area. The road we're going along is Craven Street, and we're going to take a right. I'm going to show you a little hidden theatre called the Players Theatre. Benjamin Franklin lived up here quite a few years. In the 1980s, when they were redesigning the house and they were doing some work in the foundations, in the basement, they found about 10 skeletons. And for a while, they thought Benjamin Franklin could have been one of Britain's worst serial killers. And then they realised that he rented a room in the basement to a student doctor who had to dissect and examine bodies as part of his training. That's Benjamin Franklin House right there. He lived there for a long time. They have a little museum in there as well. Let's turn around here. So we're very near Embankment Station, which was built in 1870. So that's along there and to the right. But these are 2 pubs which have been made into one. It's called the Ship and Shovel. So on the left-hand side, it was the ship, and on the right-hand side, it was the shovel. And in 1998, the owners of the 2 completely separate pubs bought the basement beneath, the cellars, and they said, let's make it one pub. So it's quite unique in that it's a pub on 2 sides of a road. We're going to go under these arches, the Villiers arches. So what's above us when we go under them is the platforms, or are the platforms of Charing Cross Station. Villiers arches, named after George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. So the signal may dip a tiny bit as we're under here, so do apologise. The ship, yeah, S-H-I-P, Jim. Behave yourself. Oh, Jim. So we might lose a bit of connection, but do bear with me, we'll get it again. This is what they call the Charing Cross Theatre, but it used to be known as the Players Theatre. Originally opened in 1936, but not here, it was in Covent Garden. And then just as the war started, they realised they still wanted to play. It was a very small place in Covent Garden. They still wanted to have little vaudeville and burlesque shows to entertain people, even during the war. So they moved here. They felt it was a bit safer. So it was a Victorian-style music hall, and now it's a bit more modern. It's got a nice bar as well. It's quite clever to do this under arches. It's one of those places that opens late if you're an actor and you're working in town, or your front of house, or your bar, or box office, or crew, orchestra. You can come to places like this, and they have a license until about 1 or 2 in the morning. I remember a good few years ago, I came in here for a drink after a show. And there was a guy playing on the piano, and I said, "Oh, who's playing? He's quite good." And they said, "Oh, that's Jack Black." The film star Jack Black just come in for a drink and just wanted to play around on the piano. This is Heaven nightclub. Now, it doesn't look that big, but it's built inside some wine cellars, which are underneath Charing Cross Station. This is the main entrance. There are many exits, but a lot of these buildings now, they just have one entrance. They like to get people through one door. And there was a man named Derek Frost who had seen Studio 54 in New York. And he thought, I want that kind of super club in London. And it holds 1,500. It's owned by the GAY group, who own quite a few gay clubs along Old Compton Street and Charing Cross Road. It was owned by Richard Branson for a while, in the 1980s, not anymore. Okay, let's go onto Villiers Street. So I mentioned George Villiers, who was the Duke of Buckingham. A lot of the names of the roads around here are named after dukes and earls of certain parts of the country. So you've got a Buckingham Street, you've got a Northumberland Street, there's a Villiers Street. And this man, George Villiers, his family sold it in the 1670s, all of this land. It was one big mansion. And he said, well, I want to be remembered after I've sold it, so I want the roads named after me. There's even an Of Avenue, because he wanted the middle part of his name to be remembered. 3 quite well-known people lived on this road. 2 were diarists. One was John Evelyn, who was a political diarist. Another one was Samuel Pepys, P-E-P-Y-S, who lived and worked in this area in the 1660s, when all the theatres were reopened under the restoration of Charles II. And he used to visit a lot of them. And he wrote about culture, rather than writing who was in power and all the political decisions. He woke up in the morning, he told us what he had for breakfast, where he would visit, who he would go to see. And another person that lived along here was Rudyard Kipling. There's a Kipling house right down the bottom. Rudyard Kipling's autobiography was written on this very road. So now we're coming up onto the Strand, just near Charing Cross Station. So Charing is an old English word for turning. That's where the river turns. So behind us, the river turns, and when you go to places like Westminster, which would be to the left of us, a bit further west, the river for a while doesn't go east to west, it goes north to south. And the bridges go east to west. And this is the cross itself at Charing Cross. Originally, it was a bit further along the river than here, but the station is named after this cross. Edward I, when his wife Eleanor of Castile passed away, she passed away in Lincoln, and he built 12 crosses and had them put at different stops along the way, and one of them was here. So a cross on the turning of the river. And there's the station itself, which leads to southeast London, the hotel above. So Charing Cross Station is a train station, but it's also an underground. Underground started way back in the 1860s. And 55% of the underground is overground, which is a bit confusing. People often can take a train for 5 stops, and not one of those stops is actually underground. But they were originally. The first one was in Baker Street, and that was what they called a cut and cover station. So they just dug a trench, and then they put a covering over the trench, and then they built it basically just underneath the ground. You see that a lot in the middle of Manhattan, where you can actually look down and sometimes see the platforms. But the tubes changed everything. People could travel a bit further. Of course, with the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the people were living in the country, and they wanted to come and work in factories. They wanted to work in industry in London. And then they decided that they wanted to come and see theatre as well. So a lot of the plays, they decided, rather than having burlesque and last 2 or 3 hours and maybe have 3 productions a day, it was the theatre's way of making a bit more money. This is obviously Trafalgar Square. There have been 3 different Trafalgar Square theatres. And if you ask somebody where the Trafalgar Theatre is today, it's way down along Whitehall. And it was originally called the Whitehall Theatre, then the Trafalgar Square Theatre, now the Trafalgar Theatre. And then there was about a 4-year period where it was called the Trafalgar Studios as well. So if you ask anybody where the Trafalgar Theatre is, you just basically get into Trafalgar Square and you take a little detour down about 8 roads until you find it. There's the National Gallery in front of us. So let's go up. We're going to go up a little bit of Charing Cross Road. What you can see on front of you when it's all covered up is the National Portrait Gallery. The National Gallery is to the left. That's still open. The National Portrait Gallery, they're doing a bit of work, but a lot of their paintings, a lot of their sculptures, a lot of their miniatures, they have great miniature paintings in there. They've now gone to other places in the country. The theatre right in front of us, in the centre of the screen, is the London Coliseum, which opened in 1904. It's not a hidden theatre, it's one of the biggest in London, the biggest stage anyway. You can see an enormous Ukrainian flag on the outside of it, which is fantastic. It's now home to the ENO. Coliseum's a great one. They've had cricket matches in there. It's such a big theatre. Middlesex and Surrey played a cricket match there in the early 1900s. One of the first theatres to have elevators. And it had a removable royal box, which could attach to the side of the theatre. So the royal family could just get into the box and it could be wheeled round to the side of the theatre, so they don't have to mix with the public. It never worked, though. It was only required once, and it never worked. It came off the tracks. And the box itself went to be a box office at Sadler's Wells, which is in Islington. Underneath us, actually, is the Jubilee Line platform of Charing Cross. It's one of the unused tube line platforms. So there are quite a few tube stations. Jubilee is the grey platform if you're ever looking at the tube map. And for many years it only went to Green Park, and they wanted it to go a bit further, towards Westminster. And the problem was, if they built it going through Charing Cross, it would destroy the foundations of Nelson's Column. So you have a disused platform right underneath where we're stood. I'm going to show us the Garrick Theatre. Now, a lot of theatres, if you joined me yesterday, are named after royalty. David Garrick is theatre royalty. He was an impresario in the 1700s. Actor, manager, director, theatre owner, and he now has a theatre named after him. It opened in 1889. Originally for melodrama, so not really plays as such, plays with piano accompaniment. Actually, it was under Garrick's reign at Drury Lane that we have him to thank for doing Shakespeare's actual plays. For many years, people were a bit depressed when they watched plays like Hamlet and Othello and King Lear, so they gave a lot of them happy endings. And when he took over, he said, I think Shakespeare knew what he was doing. Now, the problem with this is that in the 1800s, when the Garrick Theatre opened, 1889, another Garrick Theatre was open in Whitechapel. That's nice of the buses, right? That's good of them. 3 a.m. nappies, zap it. Yeah, so it's confusing. People were going to Whitechapel, to the Garrick Theatre there instead of this one. My favourite story about the Garrick Theatre involves these telephone boxes here. In 1954, an actor named Maurice Micklewhite was fed up that he wasn't getting any acting work, and he called his agent after watching a play called The Caine Mutiny, and he said, I need to change my name so it sounds a bit snappier. And the agent said, what do you want to change it to? And he said, what about Michael Caine? Virginia got in there first. Good work, Virginia. I should have made that a pub quiz. Okay, so we're on Charing Cross Road. We're going to just pop down Cecil Court and we're going to see the site of the Duke of York's and the Noel Coward. Busy today. They've closed off quite a few roads in the West End. I don't know what kind of work they're doing. 2 weeks ago, they'd closed off the entirety of Shaftesbury Avenue, which was a bit of a nightmare for anyone driving, or anyone doing deliveries especially. It seems that the traffic is moving a bit more than it was an hour ago. Another reason people seem to get lost a lot in the West End is that theatres have names named after where they are, and then you go to that road and the theatre's not on that road. So the Theatre Royal Drury Lane is not on Drury Lane, it's on a road called Catherine Street. It was on Drury Lane until it burnt down in 1809. Then they decided to make it face Covent Garden, but the name was too famous to change, so they could have called it the Theatre Royal Catherine Street. There is a theatre on Drury Lane, the Gillian Lynn, another one which used to have different names. It was called the Middlesex Music Hall, and then for many years it was called the New London Theatre. And Cats used to be on there for 25 years, and for 10 of those years at Drury Lane, Miss Saigon was on. And there are stories where people would sit during Miss Saigon for an hour or so before the intermission, and then complain during the intermission that they hadn't seen any cats. I thank you. So the road we've just come down is Cecil Court. There are quite a few roads around here that are inspirations, we think, for Harry Potter locations. I think this might have been Nocturne Alley or Diagon Alley, we're not sure, but it's a bookseller, antique stores. This was where Foyles, the bookshop, first had a shop along here. And Mozart lived here as well. When he was 8 years old, he stayed in this area. I believe he composed the London Symphony, or began composing it, when he lived just up there on the left. 8 years old. My goodness, took his time, didn't he? The Apollo Theatre is an interesting one on Shaftesbury Avenue, because it's one of three. There's one in Hammersmith, a Hammersmith Apollo. There's one Shaftesbury Avenue, and there's one which we visited yesterday, the Apollo Victoria. There was a show once on at the Apollo Shaftesbury Avenue called Keane, about the actor Edmund Keane. And there was a band in the 90s called Keane, Keane. And they were playing in Hammersmith. And I know a few of the people that work at the Apollo Shaftesbury Avenue, and they said coachloads of people were turning up that week that Keane were on, expecting to see the band, and it was a play that had Anthony Sher in it. So this is the Noel Coward. Again, a theatre that has been renamed. Now, Noel Coward, if you know him, a great musical theatre star, great actor, great writer, quite private with his personal life. But this was the first place where one of his plays was on. And it's got Dear Evan Hansen at the moment, which is one of the great shows that have come from the States. One of the only shows actually in the West End that hasn't been adapted from another source. It's a brand new musical. It's won Olivier's as well. Opened in 1903, and it was originally known as the New Theatre. And then it was renamed in the 1970s the Albury, after a man called Sir Bronson Albury, who was the manager here. And then in 2006, renamed again. So I'd say you take a random group of 100 people and you say, where's the Noel Coward Theatre? I'd say most of them wouldn't know. But if you said, do you know where Dear Evan Hansen is? They'd be able to tell you. John Gielgud ran this theatre for a couple of years. Puccini saw a play here called Madame Butterfly. He was inspired to write an opera because of it. One of my favourite stories is that Charlie Chaplin, at the age of 14, had his only real acting stage performance in a play called Sherlock Holmes. Which is interesting. And as we look down, quickly look down, you see how quiet this road is. St Martin's Lane is not a great road if you're driving in London, because if you go right down to the end, you can't take a right into Trafalgar Square. You have to turn left, and it takes you back into Covent Garden. It takes you in a big circle. And you can see the orb that's turning the London Colosseum and the church, St Martin in the Fields, which is what the road is named after, St Martin's Lane. All right, let's turn this around slowly. Along we go. We're going to stop up at the site of the Arts Theatre, which is not so much a hidden theatre, it's just a very small theatre where in the old days you used to be able to buy a ticket as a membership for a theatre. This was pre-censorship, so any time really before the mid-60s, plays were censored by the Lord Chamberlain. It even happened in Shakespeare's day. It's often why Shakespeare set plays in other countries, so we could talk about all the problems of England and not really get in trouble for it. We could say, well, we're talking about somewhere else. The social and political problems people would know. And there were many plays in London in the 20s and 30s, and the Scandinavian plays especially, a lot of them involved suicides or extramarital affairs. And the Lord Chamberlain said, you can't have these plays on in London. We need to promote something else. So places like the Arts Theatre here opened theatre clubs. This opened in 1927 as a members-only club for unlicensed plays, plays that weren't given permission for other theatres. By the way, we're so close to the St. Martin's Theatre, where the Mousetrap is on. This is the legend that is Agatha Christie here. You've got those two fellows behind as well, so you can take a postcard of that. You've got two lads as well. There she is. Sold over 2 billion copies of her books. The Mousetrap opened just around the corner from here in 1952. It's in its 70th year in the West End. Not the original cast, they have changed it. It's of course Miss Jane Marple, Hercule Poirot, but I suppose the Mousetrap is what she's most famous for. Now this is the Arts, 1927. Opened as a theatre club. So you could buy a ticket for the night, and it was a members-only club. It was quite a clever way of doing it, that you could join and say, well, it's just a private thing, but we're going to watch this play. And then at the end of the night, when the play ended, your membership ended. And there were a few of them. Most of them were outside of the West End. So the Gate in Notting Hill, the Hampstead Everyman. But this was the most famous of them all. Mark R. said, Miss Marple, named after the town I was born in. Oh, that's nice. 1955, a young Peter Hall, Sir Peter Hall, 24 years old, he directed an English language version of a French play called En attendant Godot, Waiting for Godot, which was originally written in the French language. Holds only 350 people. Showing the Choir of Man. Okay. Now we're going to take a bit of a walk, because I'd like us to try and see the Soho Theatre, which is not somewhere we've ever been on any of these tours before. So I'm going to get my skates on. I'll show you and talk about a few things on the way. Just to the left there is the old London Hippodrome. In the early 1900s had many equestrian events. So you had horses, camels, goats, monkeys, all in one theatre. And the stalls, the orchestra seats, once you were sat, the aisles would fill up with water and boats would just sail down the aisles. But it was ridiculously expensive to put on shows at the Hippodrome. So it turned into a bit of a burlesque venue. So you had singers and cabaret artists play there. And then it became a casino, which is what it is today. Peter Stringfellow owned it as a discotheque for a while. But it was also a big jazz venue for many years. So we're going back onto Charing Cross Road. We're going to cut through somewhere, if you were with me, that we saw the other day. Sort of the Lyceum. So Charing Cross Road, of course, is known for bookshops. You have this newly literate population in the 1800s. People were getting a good education. They were able to read and write. And theatres were becoming so popular that a lot of people didn't want to see jugglers and comedians and singers and dancers anymore. They wanted straight plays, dramas and comedies. And not as many English writers were writing them, so they got writers from Ireland, writers from Sweden, writers from Norway, writers from the United States. And anyone reading at home, books were expensive, but magazines, periodicals, were not as expensive. So we all know Charles Dickens, most of his work was serialized in a magazine called All the Way Round. It's the same with people like Arthur Conan Doyle. I don't know if you folks have done the same, but I've done that over the years. Bought magazines and there's a new chapter. Even Stephen King did that. with the Green Mile. He sold it as a little mini pamphlet, one chapter each month, harking back to those days. So we passed this yesterday. It feels like only yesterday. The Lyceum is a bit further away from here, but this rivals the Lyceum for one of the best fronts of a West End theatre. If you haven't got these Regency archways, this kind of great Victorian look like an opera house is what you want in a West End theatre. So many of them have bomb damage, so many of the posters and the billboards that you see outside theatres cover up the old bomb damage. But the Lyceum down in Covent Garden has these 4 enormous pillars. The Haymarket that we saw yesterday, beautiful pillars. But this was originally built as an English opera house. But in the 1980s, when Andrew Lloyd Webber owned it, he decided to take off all of the billboards. If you can imagine, that entire front was covered in billboards advertising the show. And now you can see the architecture again, showing Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Okay, we're going to cross down, hopefully get to the Soho Theatre in the next few minutes. Okay, here we go. Perfect. I'm going to go for it. So we're crossing into Soho, really. Soho, named after the hunting cry, we believe, of Henry VIII. These were all his hunting grounds in the 1500s. So whenever he saw a small animal, he would shout, "Soho!" and they would chase after it. Different, of course, to the Manhattan Soho, which is south of Houston. So Mozart lived in this area as well for a few weeks. His family went on what they called a grand tour. And all the rich did that. They would travel Europe, just stopping off at different countries. Nice thing to do. You may, if you're walking around here, see plaster noses stuck on walls. They're normally above the review bars, or the strip clubs, as we say. The 7 Noses of Soho, they're called. There's a man called Rick Buckley. He originally put more than 30 of them hidden around Soho and Piccadilly. And he said that it was a comment upon CCTV and snooping. Most of them were removed, but there are 7 ones which are still around. And they say if you find them, you're not allowed to tell anyone where they are, but if you do find all 7, you will gain unlimited riches. I found 3 of them. Jimi Hendrix Experience recorded Are You Experienced? Just down there's Ronnie Scott's Jazz Bar. That's where Jimi Hendrix last played in London. That's Frith Street, Frith. The road we're going on to is Dean Street. The first disco in London was just around the corner from here on Greek Street. It's called La Poubelle. It was originally on a road called Poland Street, and then it moved to Greek Street, 1959. Wouldn't have been disco music back then. There's also a Manette Street just behind us. It's named after Manette, the character in Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. But this is Media Central. So it seems quite apt that John Logie Baird, down on Frith Street, first demonstrated television in the 1920s. And this is where all the TV and film companies are based in this area. And the espresso bars, the coffee bars started here in the 1950s. And they became very popular in the 60s. because everyone was out all night, you see. Nothing's changed. Okay, so this is Dean Street. Quite a few theatres are no longer here. There are about 60 lost London theatres. In Leicester Square, there's the old Empire Theatre, the Alhambra, the Gaiety Theatre on the Strand, the St James's in Piccadilly, the Theatre Royal Lincoln's Inn, the Swan Theatre, which would have been there in Shakespeare's day, is now underneath the Tate Modern. But all of those theatres, Alhambra, Empire, Gaiety, St James's, and Theatre Royal Lincoln's Inn, all held over 2,000 people, and the buildings have been demolished. It's kind of tragic. Okay, we are nearly at the Soho Theatre. So we haven't done this on these hidden theatre tours because I found it was a bit of a walk to get here. But we weren't allowed to go down Whitehall today. There was a demonstration there, so I thought, last minute change, we'll take a walk and I'll talk about theatre on the way. But this is the Soho Theatre. It only opened in the year 2000. There was a Soho Theatre company, and they opened in the 80s, and they performed at places like the Riverside Studios in Hammersmith, the Royal Court Theatre in Sloane Square. And then in 2000, they got their own actual venue. Soho Theatre has 3 theatres. Now, it's not so much hidden. The problem is, when you come in here and you book to see a show, you're never 100% sure which theatre you're going into. There's a main space, which holds 165. There's a studio theatre on the second floor, which holds 90. And in the basement, there's a cabaret venue, which holds 140. So when you say the Soho Theatre, people often say, which of the venues? And you say, oh, I don't know, I'll find out when I get there. Normally has new plays on here. But I like it. Let's see who's on. Anyone we know? An old Scottish comedian you may have heard of, called Jack Doherty. Quite well known. The show on Channel 4 years ago. No, I don't recognise many of them. Mark Watson, the Welsh comedians up there. And as we turn round, we're going towards Oxford Street, and suddenly it becomes really busy. Now, folks, I'm back in the game. Hopefully, that was something that was kind of enjoyable. Thank you, Gail. Thank you so much. We had a little wander around, sitting in Canada, drinking coffee and walking around London with you. Thank you, Gail. It's great. I love doing these. And it's strange when you get here an hour before and they say you can't go down this road. And you suddenly think, okay, where can I go? So you run around the streets thinking, would this be interesting to my friends on Hago? Hopefully it was. I might leave you be and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you, Robin. Thank you for any contributions. It does really help. Helps me get the train in, if anything. Join me tonight, and I'm going to do a little play reading from home about 8:45. We'll see how that goes. That'll be a new thing for us. So join me if you're up. If you're in bed, have a lovely evening. And I will chat to you very soon. Lots of love, everyone. I'll just leave you with a view of St Anne's Court, which leads all the way along to Wardour Street and the London Palladium a bit further on. Take care, lovely people.